She cleaned his house every day, cared for his children as if they were her own, and never asked for anything in return. Until the day Eduardo came home early and found his girlfriend humiliating this woman, who, in silence, only hugged the twins. It was then that he understood who truly loved his children. Eduardo Matarazzo had a habit few knew. Every time he entered his own home, he paused in the grand foyer and listened. It wasn't paranoia, it was control. The same control he used in holding company meetings, in multi-million-dollar contracts, in negotiations that lasted all night. Eduardo didn't like surprises. He liked to know exactly what was happening in every corner of his world. That afternoon, he returned early. A last-minute meeting cancellation. His chauffeur dropped him at the gate, and Eduardo dismissed the car with a quick gesture. He walked around the side of the house, entered through the back door, something he rarely did. He crossed the empty kitchen and then stopped. He stopped because he heard a voice he didn't recognize. It wasn't the tone, it was the cruelty. "You think you can sit on the living room sofa as if you belong here?" The voice came from the hallway connecting the kitchen to the main living area. Eduardo took 2 steps and was partially hidden behind the wall. What he saw in the next few seconds changed the entire direction of his life. Denise stood in the center of the room, her index finger pointed like a weapon, her body leaning forward, dominant, occupying space as if marking territory. And in front of her, cornered against the wall, was Clara. Clara wasn't crying. Clara wasn't screaming. Clara was silent, her 2 hands holding Tay and Enzo's shoulders, keeping the twins behind her body. The boy's eyes were wide. Enzo clutched the hem of Clara's uniform so tightly his knuckles were white. "I've told you I don't want these boys running around the house when I'm here. And I've told you, you're not a nanny. You're the housekeeper. A housekeeper cleans. She doesn't sit, doesn't eat at the table, doesn't play with Eduardo's children as if she were family." Denise spoke without raising her voice. That was the detail that chilled Eduardo's blood. She wasn't out of control. She was calculated. Every word came out like a precise, surgical instruction designed to diminish. Clara swallowed hard. Eduardo saw the movement of her throat, saw her shoulders rise and fall once. And then Clara did something Eduardo would never forget. She knelt down, placing herself at his children's level, and whispered something in Tay's ear. The boy nodded. Clara stood up, took each twin's hand, and began to walk towards the hallway, the same hallway where Eduardo was hiding. "I'm not finished talking to you." Clara stopped, didn't turn around, took a deep breath, and said, without looking back, with a voice so firm it seemed made of iron, "Yes, you are, because in front of these children, you will not say another word." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but to Eduardo, it felt like an eternity. Denise opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No sound came out. For the first time since Eduardo had known her, Denise Bulhões had no reply. Clara continued walking. The twins held her hands. Tay looked straight ahead, chin raised, unconsciously imitating Clara. Enzo still trembled, but didn't let go of her hand. Eduardo retreated 3 steps, leaning against the kitchen wall, feeling the cold marble on his back. His hands were clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. He stood there for a long time. He didn't know how long. He heard Clara's footsteps going up the stairs with the boys. He heard the distant sound of a door closing, and then silence. In the living room, Denise picked up her phone and sat on the sofa as if nothing had happened. Eduardo didn't confront anyone that afternoon, didn't say a word, went up to his office, locked the door, and looked out the window that overlooked the garden. The garden Clara kept impeccable, though it wasn't part of her duties. The garden where the twins played every afternoon, the garden Denise never set foot in. The image wouldn't leave his head. It wasn't Denise's aggression, though that had hit him like a blow. It was something else. It was Clara, kneeling down to the boy's level. It was the whisper. It was the hand holding a hand. It was the voice that didn't tremble. It was the dignity. Eduardo knew powerful people. Bank presidents, judges, senators, people who spoke loudly, commanded rooms, bent wills. But he had never seen power like that. The power of someone who had nothing. No title, no surname, no bank account, and yet refused to be diminished. Not out of pride, not out of anger, but because there were 2 children who needed to see that someone in that house had the courage to say enough. Yes, you are, because in front of these children, you will not say another word. The phrase echoed. Eduardo repeated it mentally once, twice, 10 times. And with each repetition, something inside him shifted, like a piece of furniture that had been in the wrong place for so long that he had grown accustomed to avoiding it. Now, suddenly, he saw the empty space where the piece should be. When was the last time he himself had protected the twins from anything? When was the last time he had knelt down to their level and whispered something that made them feel safe? Eduardo Matarazzo knew how to close $80 million contracts, knew how to read balance sheets, anticipate market trends, identify corporate risks before any analyst, but he didn't know his children's teacher's name. He didn't know Enzo was afraid of thunder. He didn't know Tay drew every night before bed and hid the drawings under his pillow. Clara knew. Clara knew because she was the one who put the boys to sleep when Eduardo had business dinners. She was the one who warmed the milk to the right temperature, who checked under the bed to prove there were no monsters, who left the hallway light on because Enzo couldn't sleep in total darkness. Eduardo knew none of this, and the shame of that ignorance was worse than anything he had ever felt. It was past 10 p.m. when he came downstairs. The house was silent. Denise had left, probably for her downtown penthouse, as she did when she didn't want to stay. Eduardo walked to the twins' room, opened the door slowly. Both were asleep. Tay was on his stomach, arm dangling off the bed. Enzo was wrapped in his blanket like a cocoon, his face serene. Between the two beds, on the nightstand, was a glass of water with a lemon slice, exactly as Enzo liked it. And next to the glass, a folded piece of paper. Eduardo picked up the paper, opened it. It was a drawing by Tay, 4 stick figures, 2 small boys holding hands, a woman beside them, larger, with a wide smile, and above the 3, written in a child's shaky, enormous letters, a single word: family. The 4th figure, a man, was on the other side of the paper, alone, without a smile, holding a briefcase. Eduardo stood still, looking at that drawing for so long that his eyes began to sting not from anger, not from exhaustion, but from recognition. His own children had drawn their family, and their family didn't include their father's girlfriend, didn't include any of the people Eduardo thought mattered. Their family was Clara. He was the man with the briefcase on the other side of the paper, alone. Eduardo carefully folded the drawing, put it in his jacket pocket, and left his children's room with a certainty he didn't yet have words for, but which already weighed like lead in the center of his chest. He went downstairs to the kitchen, Missus. Zilda was there, as almost always, organizing the next morning's provisions. The cook had worked in the house since before the twins were born. She knew every corner, every sound, every silence of that mansion. Zilda. The cook turned slowly, measuring his expression with the experience of someone who had read faces for decades. "You saw?" It wasn't a question. Eduardo sat on the kitchen island bench, something he never did. He always ate in the dining room, always with correct posture, always in the right place. But that night he sat in the kitchen like a man who no longer knew where he belonged. "How long has this been happening, Zilda?" The cook opened a drawer, took out a dishcloth, and began drying glasses that were already dry. Her hands needed movement for her mouth to speak. "Since the beginning." Eduardo closed his eyes. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Mrs. Zilda placed the glass on the shelf, turned to him, and said something Eduardo would carry for the rest of his life. "Because you never stayed long enough to see." The kitchen clock ticked away each second. Eduardo looked at his own hands, hands that signed contracts, that shook investors' hands, hands that never trembled. That night, they trembled. And Clara, what does she do when this happens? Zilda offered a small smile, sad and proud at the same time. "The same thing you saw today. She takes the boys and removes them from the scene. Never screams, never fights back, never complains to anyone. After the boys are asleep, she comes back and finishes her work, as if nothing happened. Every time, every time." Eduardo ran a hand over his face, took a deep breath, and asked the question that, in truth, wasn't about Clara, but about him. "Zilda, are my children happy?" The cook paused, looked at him with a compassion Eduardo didn't deserve, but which she offered anyway. "Your children are loved, Eduardo, but not by whom you think." The kitchen fell silent. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. Eduardo got up from the bench, walked to the door, and stopped. "Tomorrow I need coffee earlier. It will be ready." Eduardo went back upstairs to his office, but he didn't sleep. He sat in his armchair all night with Tay's drawing open on the table. 4 stick figures, 3 together, 1 separate. And for the first time in many years, Eduardo Matarazzo didn't know what his next step would be, because all the next steps he could imagine required something that money couldn't buy: the courage to see what he had refused to see. Eduardo didn't sleep. When the first light of morning entered through the office curtain slats, he was still in the same position. Tay's drawing remained open on the table, like a map revealing a territory he had never explored. the emotional life of his own children. He went downstairs before anyone else in the house woke up. The kitchen already smelled of coffee. Mrs. Zilda kept promises with her usual precision. Eduardo sat on the same bench as the night before. The cook placed the cup in front of him without saying a word. She didn't need to. The silence between them already carried everything that had been said the previous night. Eduardo drank his coffee slowly. Each sip tasted different, not because the coffee was different, but because he was paying attention. Paying attention to the sounds of the house, waking up, to the footsteps upstairs, to the boys' bathroom faucet, and then, a sound he had never noticed before, a soft voice, humming quietly Clara. She was singing to the twins as she helped them get ready. Eduardo couldn't make out the melody. It was something simple, perhaps an old song that passes from mother to daughter without anyone remembering where it came from. But the effect was clear. Laughter. The laughter of his children, one after another, then both together, mixed with Clara's voice. Eduardo put his cup on the table, stood still, listening. How long had it been since he heard his children laugh like that? Not the polite laughter they offered at formal dinners. Not the restrained smiles they showed when Denise was present, but real laughter. The kind that comes from deep in the chest. The kind that asks no permission. The kind that only happens when a child feels safe. The twins ran down the stairs. Tay in front, as always, the bravest. The one who was first to everything. Enzo right behind, clutching a sketchbook to his chest like a shield. Both stopped when they saw their father in the kitchen. Father? The surprise in Tay's voice hurt more than any word Denise had said the day before. The boy was genuinely astonished to find his father there at that hour, in that place, as if Eduardo were a visitor in his own home. Good morning. Eduardo tried to smile. Tay looked at Enzo. Enzo looked at Tay. That silent communication that only twins master. An entire language made of glances and micro-expressions that the rest of the world couldn't translate. Aren't you going to work today, sir? Enzo asked, cautiously. Sir. His children called him sir. Eduardo swallowed the information like swallowing something that scratched his entire throat on the way down. Yes, I am, but I wanted to have breakfast with you today. Another glance between the twins. This time, something different. A shadow of hope mixed with distrust. The distrust of someone who had learned, even so young, that adult promises are fragile. Clara appeared at the top of the stairs. Eduardo saw her before she saw him. She was wearing her work uniform, her hair tied back, her hands still damp from having helped the boys wash their faces. When she noticed Eduardo in the kitchen, she paused. A brief, almost imperceptible pause, like someone recalculating a route mid-journey. Good morning, Mr. Matarazzo. Her voice was professional, neutral, the same voice as always. No trace of the woman who, hours earlier, had faced Denise with the firmness of one who had nothing left to lose. Clara came down the stairs, went straight to the cleaning supply cabinet, and began organizing her materials for the day. Eduardo watched her. For the first time, he truly observed. He saw how Clara moved through the house, unhurriedly but efficiently. Every gesture had purpose. She knew exactly where everything was, not because she was forced to know, but because she treated that house as if it mattered. She straightened a cushion on the sofa, repositioned a slightly crooked photo frame on the shelf, stopped before the living room window, and drew back the curtains with a broad movement, letting the light flood the room. The twins went to her before going to the table. They didn't go to their father, they went to Clara. Tay showed her something in Enzo's sketchbook, and Clara leaned in to look, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder as she listened. Enzo pointed to a detail in the drawing. Clara nodded, said something Eduardo couldn't hear, and Enzo smiled in that way only children smile when someone takes something they've made seriously. Eduardo was less than 15 feet away and was invisible. Breakfast happened in partial silence. The twins ate and exchanged glances. Eduardo tried to start a conversation twice. Tay replied with short, polite, unsubstantial phrases. Enzo merely nodded. It wasn't rebellion. It was distance. The distance of someone who doesn't know how to behave near someone who should be familiar but isn't. When the boys finished, they got up from the table and headed towards the door, where the chauffeur was already waiting to take them to school. They stopped halfway, turned, and said, Father, can Clara pick us up today? Eduardo frowned. Pick you up? But the driver always takes and picks you up. Clara picks us up better. Eduardo was about to ask what that meant, but Tay had already left. Enzo stood still for an extra second, looking at his father with something Eduardo couldn't decipher. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness. It was something between expectation and resignation, as if the boy wanted to say something but had long since given up on being heard. When the door closed, Eduardo was alone in the dining room. Missus, Zilda was clearing the dishes. Clara had already disappeared upstairs. And then Eduardo did something out of character. He picked up his phone, called his office, and told his assistant he wouldn't be in that morning. Reschedule everything for the afternoon. There was a surprise silence on the other end of the line. Eduardo Matarazzo didn't reschedule meetings. Eduardo Matarazzo was the meetings. But the assistant merely confirmed and hung up. Eduardo stayed in the house and began to pay attention to everything. He watched Clara change the twins' bedding with a care that went beyond professional. He saw how she smoothed the sheets with her hands, as if preparing a nest. He saw that in Enzo's room, she placed the pillow on the left side because the boy slept facing the door. And in Tay's room, the pillow was in the center because he slept on his stomach and needed more space. Small, silent details, invisible to anyone not looking. Clara knew how each of his children slept. Eduardo didn't. He went down to his office and sat at his computer, but he didn't open spreadsheets. He opened the left-hand drawer, where he kept personal documents. He looked for Clara's employment record, found it. Full name, Clara de Souza Ventura, hired just over 3 years ago. References, 2 previous families, both with praise. Marital status, single, dependents, none. Address, a modest neighborhood in the north side. That was all he knew about the woman who was raising his children. Eduardo leaned back in his chair and looked at that record as one looks at a mirror that reflects not the face, but the character. 3 years. Clara had been in the twins' lives for 3 years. She had seen their first steps at school, their first written words, their first fears, their first difficult questions. And Eduardo had reduced all of that to an employment record with 6 lines. His phone rang. Eduardo looked at the screen. Denise. He let it ring once, twice, 3 times. The phone stopped. Seconds later, a message. Love, dinner tonight? I booked that restaurant you like. Eduardo read the message and felt something he didn't expect. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No warmth, no anticipation, no desire to see her. As if the woman who wrote that message was a stranger he met at a party, and whose presence no longer made any difference. He put his phone in his pocket without replying. Afternoon came, and Eduardo forced himself to go to the office. He went through meetings on autopilot, present in body, absent in everything else. His partner, Maurice, noticed something different during an important negotiation. Eduardo, are you with us? I am. Doesn't seem like it. Eduardo didn't explain. He wouldn't know how. How to tell his partner that the CEO of a billion-dollar holding company had been undone by a stick figure drawing. How to explain that a housekeeper had said 7 words that were worth more than all the leadership speeches he had ever given. Yes, you are. Because in front of these children, you will not say another word. 7 words, without screaming, without trembling, without asking permission. Eduardo left the office early for the 2nd consecutive time. Another thing that never happened. When he got home, he went straight to the kitchen. Zilda was preparing dinner. Zilda, I need to ask you something. The cook dried her hands on her apron and waited. My children, do they talk about me? Zilda looked at him with that gaze that mixed compassion and an ancient toughness of someone who had seen too much to sugarcoat truths. They talk about Clara. Eduardo nodded slowly. The answer was expected, but hearing it aloud carried a different weight, the weight of a sentence. And when Denise is here? Zilda returned to stirring the pot. The sound of the spoon against the metal bottom filled the silence for a few seconds. When Denise is here, the boys stay in their room. Don't come down, don't make noise, eat quickly, and ask to be excused. Since when? Always. Eduardo leaned against the counter. His hands clutched the edge of the marble so tightly his knuckles hurt. And I never noticed. Zilda didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her silence was more eloquent than any accusation. Eduardo left the kitchen and went upstairs. In the 2nd floor hallway, he heard voices coming from the twins' room. The door was ajar. He approached silently and looked through the crack. Clara was sitting on the floor between the 2 beds. Tay was lying on his stomach on his bed, chin resting on his hands, looking at Clara. Enzo was on the floor beside her, leaning against her arm, his sketchbook open on his lap. Clara, are you leaving? Enzo asked, without looking up from his sketchbook. Eduardo felt the air leave his lungs. Why are you asking that? It's because the blonde lady said she was going to fire you. Clara didn't answer immediately. Eduardo saw her shoulders move. A long, controlled breath, from someone carefully choosing each word with surgical precision. Enzo, look at me. The boy looked up. As long as you need me, I'll be here. No matter what anyone says. Understand? Enzo nodded. Te, from his bed, extended his hand. Clara held it, and Enzo placed his hand on top of theirs. 3 hands stacked like a pact. Eduardo recoiled, leaning his back against the hallway wall. His eyes burned. His throat was constricted. He put his hand in his jacket pocket and felt the folded paper, Te's drawing that he had been carrying since the night before. In that silent hallway, Eduardo Matarazzo understood something. No financial report, no market analysis, and no consultant could ever have taught him. He hadn't lost his children to another person. He had given them away. Day after day, meeting after meeting, trip after trip, he had relinquished his presence. And into the space he left empty, Clara stepped, not out of ambition, not out of strategy, but because someone needed to be there, and she chose to stay. And the woman he had brought into his home to be his partner was the same one trying to expel the only person his children loved. Eduardo went downstairs, picked up his phone, read Denise's message once more, and typed a reply that was, in truth, the beginning of a demolition. We need to talk in person tomorrow. He sent it, put his phone away, and for the first time in years, went to his children's room, opened the door, and asked, "Can I stay here with you guys?" Te and Enzo looked at him with the same surprise as that morning. Clara immediately rose from the floor, as if her employer's presence demanded she vacate the space. Eduardo looked at her and did something Clara didn't expect. "Stay, Clara, please." Clara stopped, looked at the twins. The boys looked at her, and Enzo, with the brutal naturalness only a child possesses, resolved the situation. "Sit here, father." Clara was telling a story. Eduardo sat on the floor of his own children's room for the first time in his life and listened to Clara tell a story about a bird that couldn't fly, but that walked so far, it knew more places than all the other birds combined. Te fell asleep first, then Enzo with his head tilted on Clara's shoulder, and Eduardo stayed there on the floor in silence, looking at the woman who carried the weight of his world, never having asked for anything in return. That night, Eduardo didn't sleep in the master bedroom. He slept in his office armchair, with Te's drawing in his pocket and a question that wouldn't leave him alone. If he took Clara out of that house, what would be left of his children? And if he took Denise out, what would be left of him? Eduardo woke up in his office armchair with a stiff body and a mind heavier than when he closed his eyes. Te's drawing was still in his jacket pocket. It was no longer just a piece of paper. It was an accusation he carried against himself. He slowly stood up, changed clothes, and went downstairs. The house was still silent. The twins hadn't woken up. In the kitchen, Miss Uzilda was already preparing coffee. Her eyes followed Eduardo when he walked past the table and went to the window overlooking the garden. Denise called. She confirmed. Zilda knew who he was talking about. Called last night, asking what time you wanted her. Said she's coming after lunch. Eduardo nodded without turning around. After lunch, a few hours to organize something within himself that had no form or name, something between disappointment and disgust, something between anger at Denise and anger at himself for having been blind for so long. The morning passed with unbearable slowness. Eduardo tried to work from his home office, but the words in the emails made no sense. The numbers in the reports seemed to be in another language. All he could process was the sound of the house around him, Clara cleaning downstairs, the vacuum, the faucet, and, between one noise and another, the absolute silence of a woman who worked as if she were invisible. The twins had gone to school. The house was empty of that energy only children produce. And in the emptiness, Eduardo realized something. Without the boys and without Clara, that mansion was just a building, beautiful, expensive, impeccable, but lifeless. Denise arrived promptly. Eduardo heard the click of her heels on the foyer floor. He heard her purse being placed on the console table. He heard her voice greeting Miss Uzilda with that rehearsed cordiality he now recognized as a costume. Eduardo. He was in the living room, standing by the fireplace. He didn't sit, didn't offer a drink, didn't smile. Denise noticed immediately. Her eyes scanned his face like someone reading a contract, looking for dangerous clauses. What happened? Sit, Denise. She sat on the sofa, crossed her legs, adjusted her posture. Everything calculated, everything in place. Eduardo observed her with new eyes, the same eyes that now saw details that had previously gone unnoticed. He saw how Denise occupied the sofa as if it were hers. He saw how she glanced at the bookshelf, probably checking if the decor changes she had suggested had been made. He saw how she didn't ask about the twins. She never did. I came back early the day before yesterday. A simple sentence. But the effect on Denise's face was like a crack in fine porcelain, subtle, almost invisible, but irreversible. Early? I came in through the back door, stayed in the kitchen. Silence. Eduardo saw the exact moment Denise understood. Her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. Her jaw clenched, but her recovery was swift, impressively swift. Denise exhaled through her nose and tilted her head slightly, as if preparing to explain something obvious to someone who hadn't grasped the situation. Eduardo, I know what you saw, and I understand it might have seemed excessive, but you need to understand the context. That woman doesn't respect boundaries. She acts as if she's the mother of your children. Sits on the sofa, eats at the table, interferes with their upbringing. I was just trying to establish order. Eduardo listened to every word, every justification, every attempt to reframe what he had seen with his own eyes. And as Denise spoke, he remembered Clara. Clara's silence. Clara's hand on Enzo's shoulder. The firm voice that didn't need to shout to have more authority than any speech. Establish order? Eduardo repeated, not as a question but as a statement. Yes, someone needs to do that when you're not around. And pointing your finger in her face is part of that order? Denise uncrossed her legs, recrossed them. The first sign of real discomfort. I didn't point my finger in anyone's face. I saw you, Denise. The silence that followed was not like Clara's silence, which was made of strength and choice. Denise's silence was that of someone who had run out of a script, of someone who always had a ready answer and suddenly encountered a wall she couldn't circumvent. You're making a drama out of a housekeeper. The word came out like a shot. Housekeeper, not her name, not her role. Housekeeper, spoken with a weight that revealed exactly how Denise saw Clara, and, by extension, how she saw anyone she considered beneath her. Eduardo looked her in the eyes for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper, but each syllable carried the weight of a decision already made. Clara protected my children from you, without screaming, without fighting back, without coming to tell me. She did what I should have done. And you want me to believe she's the problem? Denise blinked once, twice, and then did something Eduardo didn't expect. She didn't shout, she didn't cry, she didn't defend herself. She picked up her purse from the console table, adjusted the strap on her shoulder, and walked to the door. She paused before leaving, turned halfway. You'll regret this. When you realize that woman only wants your money, you'll remember me. And she left. The door closed with a soft click, no slam, no scene. Denise left the same way she had entered Eduardo's life. With control, with calculation, with the certainty that the world revolved around her. Eduardo stood in the empty living room. Denise's perfume still lingered in the air, and along with it, a strange feeling, not relief, as he had expected, but shame. Shame for having brought that woman into his children's lives. Shame for not having seen it sooner. Shame for having needed to witness a scene to open his eyes. Mrs. Zilda appeared at the kitchen door. She said nothing, just looked at him with that gaze that said everything without uttering a syllable. It's over, Zilda. The cook nodded slowly. What needed to end is over, but what needs to begin still has no name. Eduardo didn't understand at that moment, but he would carry that phrase for a long time. The afternoon wore on, and the twins returned from school. Eduardo was in the living room when they entered. Tay stopped at the door, looked around as if doing a security sweep, and quietly asked Mrs. Zilda, is the lady here? No, sweetie, she's not. Te exhaled. Enzo came in behind him and went straight for the stairs, probably looking for Clara. He found her in the second-floor hallway, organizing bathroom towels. Enzo simply leaned his forehead against her arm and stood there, in silence, as if recharging. Clara placed her hand on the boy's head, without stopping what she was doing. A gesture so natural, so automatic, that it was impossible for it to be rehearsed. Eduardo watched from the bottom of the stairs, and at that instant, Zilda's phrase began to make sense. What needed to end was over, but what needed to begin the rebuilding of his relationship with his own children. The recognition of who Clara truly was, the courage to look at his own failure without flinching, all of that was still a vast, unknown, and frightening terrain. Eduardo went upstairs, past Clara and Enzo without saying anything, entered his office, sat in his chair, and opened the drawer where he kept Clara's employment record. 6 lines. That was all he had. He picked up the phone, dialed a number he hadn't used in ages. Maurice, I need a personal favor, not professional. His partner was surprised but listened. I want to know more about someone. Clara de Souza Ventura. Everything that's public and accessible, without invading anything. I just want to understand who this woman is. Maurice paused. Does this have to do with how strange you were in the meeting? It has to do with everything. Eduardo hung up, looked out the window. The garden Clara tended without being asked was bathed in the late afternoon light, and somewhere in that house, A woman earning a modest salary was doing more for his children than all his money had ever managed to do. The question Eduardo asked himself that night was no longer about Denise. Denise was already in the past. The question now was about Clara, about who she was before she got there, about what she carried in silence, about the story no one in that house knew, and about what would happen when he finally found out. A few days passed since Denise's departure. The mansion changed. Not in the furniture, not in the walls, not in the objects. It changed in the air. There was a lightness Eduardo couldn't name, but which he felt every time he entered a room and found the twins out of their bedroom. Te was drawing at the dining room table. Enzo ran through the hallway with a paper airplane. Simple things children do when they're not afraid. Eduardo was trying. Every morning he came downstairs before the boys, had coffee in the kitchen, waited. When they appeared, he tried to talk. The answers were still short, polite, cautious, but something was changing. Te no longer looked at Enzo before answering. Enzo no longer asked to be excused from the table. They were minimal, almost invisible changes, but to Eduardo, they had the weight of enormous achievements. Clara remained the same, professional, silent, impeccable. If she noticed Denise had left, she didn't show it. If she felt relief, she didn't let it show. She continued to arrive at the same time, perform the same tasks, hum to the boys while getting them ready, leave the glass of water with lemon on Enzo's nightstand, adjust Te's pillow in the center of the bed. Her world didn't revolve around the dramas of her employers, it revolved around what needed to be done. Eduardo watched her with an attention that sometimes bothered him. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Perhaps a flaw, perhaps a sign that Denise was right, that Clara had some hidden interest, some agenda, some disguised ambition. But the more he looked, the less he found. Clara didn't ask for a raise, didn't mention Denise's departure, didn't try to occupy any new space. She remained exactly where she had always been. And that was precisely what disturbed Eduardo, the absolute consistency of someone who doesn't change behavior depending on who is watching. One afternoon, Maurice called. "I found what you asked for, but I think it's better if we talk in person." His partner's tone lit something in Eduardo. Maurice was a pragmatic, direct man who solved problems over the phone in 3 minutes. If he was asking for an in-person conversation, what he found wasn't simple. They met in the holding company's office. Maurice closed the door, placed a folder on the table, and sat in the opposite chair. "Before I open this, I need you to understand one thing. Everything here is public information. Records, accessible documents, local news. I didn't invade anyone's privacy." "Understood. Tell me." Maurice opened the folder. Clara de Souza Ventura, born in a rural area, raised by her maternal grandmother after her mother passed away when she was a child. Her father was out of the picture before she was born. Her grandmother did what she could. Clara went to public school, worked from an early age, managed to finish high school with good grades, had plans to study social work. Eduardo listened, immobile. She didn't pursue it, though, because her grandmother fell ill. Clara dropped everything to take care of her. Those were some difficult years. Her grandmother eventually passed away. Clara was left alone, without family, without a support network, without anything. She started working as a housekeeper to survive. Maurice turned a page. Here's where it gets interesting. Clara has an older brother, Renato de Souza Ventura, a labor lawyer, a graduate of Valley State University. He was able to study because Clara sent him money. She worked in 3 different homes to pay for his college tuition. Eduardo felt his chair become uncomfortable, not because of the chair, but because of the weight of what he was hearing. She paid for her brother's entire college education. Renato graduated, passed the bar exam, opened a small office focused on the rights of domestic workers. Today he represents housekeepers, cleaners, caregivers, people who can't afford a lawyer. He charges symbolic fees or works pro bono. And according to everything I found, his motivation is Clara. He saw what his sister went through, saw the humiliations, the employers who didn't pay, the homes where she was treated as if she wasn't human, and decided he would fight for people like her. Eduardo got up from his chair, went to the office window. The city stretched out below, buildings, cars, millions of people living lives he would never stop to imagine. Is there more? Maurice hesitated. Yes. And this part, I almost didn't include in the folder. Tell me, Maurice. Clara was dismissed from the house where she worked before yours, a family in Serene Gardens. The official reason was cost-cutting, but I found an old social media post. The family's daughter posted it at the time. The post was deleted later, but it remained in cached records. What did it say? It said the mother fired Clara because the family's father had complimented the food Clara prepared for the children one weekend. The wife interpreted it as something it wasn't. Clara was let go without notice, without full severance, without a letter of recommendation. Eduardo was silent for a long time, his hands resting on the window glass. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger. She lost her job because she cooked for the children. She lost her job because someone was jealous of the care she offered. Does that sound familiar? Maurice's question was too precise to ignore. Eduardo turned around. Denise, I'm not saying it's the exact same situation. I'm saying Clara has been through this before, being punished for caring too much. And yet, when she came to your house, she did exactly the same thing. She cared for your children as if they were her own, knowing the risk. Eduardo returned to his chair, picked up the folder, thumbed through the pages. Employment records, addresses, an old scanned photo from a local newspaper, a high school graduation, a small class, and in the corner, almost cut off by the photo's edge, a young woman with a discreet smile holding her diploma with both hands. The caption read, "Graduates of Anicio, Braga Municipal School." Clara. Eduardo closed the folder, looked at the beige cover for a time. Maurice dared not interrupt. "Maurice, how much does Clara earn in my house?" His partner frowned. "I don't have that information, but by market standards for the role, it must be something between. It doesn't matter the number. Whatever it is, it's not enough." "Eduardo, be careful. You're emotional. Decisions made like that. It's not emotion, it's shame. I have a woman in my house who gave up her own life to care for the lives of others, who paid for her brother's education by cleaning floors, who was fired for caring too much, and who nevertheless every morning comes into my house and treats my children as if they are the most precious thing in the world. And I didn't even know her full name until 4 days ago." Maurice didn't answer. There were some things that had no answer. Eduardo left the office that afternoon with the folder under his arm and a clarity that hurt like an open wound. Every piece of information about Clara was a mirror reflecting his own smallness, not financial smallness. In that, Eduardo was a giant. His human smallness, his inability to see the value of someone who didn't use value as currency. When he got home, the first thing he heard was laughter. It came from the garden. Eduardo went to the back door and stopped. Clara was crouched near the flower bed she herself cultivated. Tay was beside her, hands dirty with soil, planting something small in a pot. Enzo held the watering can with both hands, concentrating, pouring water with exaggerated care so as not to overwater. "Slowly, Enzo. She needs water, but she doesn't want to drown," Clara said, and the three laughed. Eduardo stood at the door, watching. The folder with Clara's story weighed in his left hand. And there, in that garden, the story took on form. It was no longer a report. It was a real woman, on her knees in the dirt, teaching his children to care for something living. A woman who had never had anyone to care for her. Tay looked up and saw his father at the door. "Father, Clara is teaching us to plant. This one will grow flowers." It was the first time Tay had spoken to him with genuine enthusiasm, without caution, without measuring words, as a child speaks when they forget they need to be careful with the adults around them. Eduardo descended the 3 steps leading to the garden. He crouched beside his son. "What kind of flower?" Clara said it's one that takes a long time to grow, but when it opens, it's the most beautiful of all. Eduardo looked at Clara. She was with her hands in the earth, her eyes on the pots, the serene face of someone who didn't need an audience to be who she was. He felt she noticed his gaze, but she didn't look up. She continued working. "Is that true, Clara? Does it take a long time to grow?" Clara nodded, without facing him. Things worth waiting for usually do. The phrase hung in the afternoon air. Eduardo didn't know if she was talking about the plant or something larger, and maybe that was the point. Maybe Clara never needed to explain anything. Maybe her entire life was the explanation, every gesture, every silence, every choice she made without anyone watching. That night, Eduardo put his children to sleep by himself for the first time. He tried. He got Enzo's milk temperature wrong. He forgot to check under the bed. He didn't know what story Tay wanted to hear. He did everything wrong, but he stayed. And when the boys finally fell asleep, Tay on his stomach, Enzo wrapped in his blanket, Eduardo left the room and found Clara in the hallway. She was going to check on the boys, as she did every night. They stopped facing each other. The hallway was narrow, the light was dim. "They're asleep," Eduardo said. Clara nodded, made a move to turn and leave. "Clara." She stopped. "Thank you." 1 word, 2 syllables. But Clara stood still for an instant too long to be indifferent. Her shoulders moved, That controlled breath, Eduardo now knew. When she turned, her eyes were moist, but her voice was firm. "You don't need to thank me. They deserve it." And she walked away down the hall. Eduardo stood still, looking at the empty space where Clara had been, and understood that phrase, "they deserve it," was the key to everything. Clara didn't care for the twins out of obligation, salary, or strategy. She cared because she truly believed those children deserved to be cared for simply because they existed. And if someone who had nothing could give so much, what did it mean to be someone who had everything and gave nothing? Eduardo entered his office, opened Maurice's folder once more, looked at the graduation photo, and made a decision that fit no contract and no lawyer needed to review. He was going to get to know Clara for real, not the record, not the report, the person. But what Eduardo still didn't know was that Clara also held something that wasn't in Maurice's folder, something no public record could reveal. And when that truth came to light, it wouldn't just be his life that changed, it would be the lives of everyone in that house. Eduardo began to change his routine, not in a grand or announced way, but quietly, almost timidly, like someone relearning to walk after a long time sitting still. He started leaving the office earlier, dining at home, asking the twins about school, about their drawings, about the dreams they had at night. The answers still came slowly, measured, as if the boys were testing the solidity of that new presence before trusting it. But there was progress. One of those nights, Tay showed him a drawing without Eduardo asking. It was a boat in the middle of the sea with 3 figures inside. Eduardo looked carefully. "Who are these people in the boat?" "Me, Enzo, and Clara." Eduardo waited, looked for a 4th figure. There wasn't one. "And where am I?" Tay looked at the drawing as if the question made no sense. "You're at work, father." The phrase didn't come with malice. It came with naturalness, with the relentless logic of a child describing the world as it is, unfiltered and without pity. Eduardo was the man who was at work. That's how his children saw him. That's how he had built himself in their minds, a figure associated with absence. Eduardo nodded, didn't correct, didn't ask to be included in the drawing. He understood that that place in the boat needed to be earned, not requested. Days went by, and the house found a new kind of balance. Without Denise, the atmosphere breathed. The twins came down for breakfast without scanning the room. Mrs. Zilda cooked, humming, and Clara continued to be Clara, present without intruding, caring without seeking recognition, firm without needing volume. But Eduardo began to notice something he hadn't before. Clara left the house every Wednesday afternoon, always at the same time. She always returned with eyes slightly different, not red, not swollen, but heavy with something burdensome. Mrs. Zilda covered her shift without anyone needing to ask. It was a silent, old agreement that worked without words. The first time, Eduardo paid it no mind. The second, he registered it. The third time, curiosity turned into unease. "Zilda, where does Clara go on Wednesdays?" The cook was peeling vegetables. Her hand stopped for a second, just a second, before resuming movement. "That's Clara's business, Eduardo." It was the first time Zilda had called him by his first name without Mr. in front. And it was the first time she refused to answer a question of his. Both things together formed a clear message. There was a boundary there, a territory that wasn't his. Eduardo respected it, or tried to, but the unease continued to grow, not out of distrust, but out of concern. A concern he didn't know where it came from, or where it was going, but which occupied an increasingly large space in his chest. The following Wednesday, Eduardo made a decision he knew was intrusive. He left the office in the middle of the afternoon, drove himself, without a chauffeur, and parked a safe distance from the house. He saw Clara leave through the side gate. She walked to the bus stop, waited, and boarded. Eduardo followed the bus, not with pride, but with shame. He knew he was crossing a line, but something inside him said he needed to understand, not to control. He had done that his whole life, and the result was the disaster he was living. He needed to understand, because Clara deserved to be understood, because he had spent 3 years beside a person and knew nothing about her beyond 6 lines on a file. The bus headed to the north side. Clara got off in a neighborhood Eduardo had never set foot in. Narrow streets, modest houses, local businesses with faded signs. She walked 3 blocks and entered a low building with a simple facade and a discreet plaque at the entrance. The New Start Center, a grief and support institute. Eduardo parked, stayed in his car. His heart pounded in a way he didn't recognize. It wasn't the adrenaline of negotiations. It wasn't the tension of contracts. It was fear. Fear of discovering something that would make everything more complicated than it already was. He waited. An hour passed. Clara came out of the building, accompanied by an older woman, wearing an institutional badge. The two talked on the sidewalk for a few minutes. Clara listened more than she spoke. At one point, the woman touched Clara's arm with a gesture that mixed comfort and encouragement. Clara nodded, waved, and walked back to the bus stop. Eduardo didn't follow her back. He stayed in the car, looking at the facade of the New Start Center, until the sun began to set and the streetlights came on. That night, Eduardo couldn't remain silent. He waited for the twins to fall asleep. He waited for Clara to finish her nightly rounds in the bedrooms. And when she came down the stairs to put away the last materials before leaving, he was in the kitchen. "Clara, can I speak with you for a minute?" She stopped on the last step, looked at him with that neutral expression. Eduardo now knew. The polite wall she maintained between herself and the world. "Of course, Mr. Matarazzo. Please, sit down." Clara sat on the island bench, her hands in her lap, her posture erect, ready to hear a complaint, an instruction, a demand ready for whatever an employer would say to an employee at the end of the day. Eduardo sat across from her and did something Clara didn't expect. "I need to apologize." Her face didn't change, but her hands moved. Her fingers intertwined more tightly in her lap. "Apologize for what, sir?" "For everything. For what Denise did to you. For the time I didn't see. For the time I didn't ask. For having reduced 3 years of your life in this house to a 6-line file." Clara swallowed hard. The wall trembled, but it didn't fall. "You don't need to." "Yes, I do, and I need to tell you something else. I know you go to the New Start Center on Wednesdays." The silence that followed was different from all the other silences Eduardo had witnessed in that house. It wasn't Clara's dignified silence in front of Denise. It wasn't the twins' embarrassed silence in front of their father. It was a silence of vulnerability. The silence of someone found in the only place where she allowed herself to be fragile. Clara looked away. For the first time since Eduardo had known her, she didn't maintain eye contact. She looked at her own hands, at her intertwined fingers that now trembled slightly. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know you didn't. Wednesdays are my afternoon off. I've never missed, never been late, never failed to Clara." Eduardo's voice was low, but firm enough to interrupt her. "I'm not questioning your work. I never would. I just want to know if you're okay." Clara looked at him, and in her eyes, Eduardo saw something he recognized because he himself had felt it in recent days. The exhaustion of carrying something too heavy, for too long, without anyone to share it with. "My grandmother," Clara began, and her voice faltered on the first attempt. She took a deep breath, started again. "My grandmother raised me. When she got sick, I took care of her until the end. Those were difficult years. After she was gone, I thought I had moved on. But some things you don't move on from. You learn to live with them. The New Start Center is a place where people who have lost someone important can talk. It's not therapy, it's not an obligation. It's just a place where I can talk about my grandmother without having to be strong." Clara's voice remained steady until the last sentence, but her hands told another story. They trembled. And Eduardo understood that this woman who protected his children with the firmness of a shield, who faced humiliation without backing down, who maintained her dignity in all situations, this woman also needed a place where she could let go of the burden. "Every week?" Eduardo asked, almost in a whisper. "Every week, for almost 4 years. 4 years. Clara had been going to that institute since before she worked in his house. She had carried her grandmother's grief for so long that it was already part of who she was. And no one knew, no one asked. No one looked at her enough to realize that every Wednesday, that unshakable woman went to a place where she allowed herself to break down." Eduardo extended his hand across the table, didn't touch Clara, just left his hand there in the space between them, like a bridge she could cross or not. "You don't have to be strong here too, Clara." "Not anymore." Clara looked at his hand, looked at his face, and did something Eduardo had never seen her do. She cried, without a sound, without a sob. The tears simply flowed down her face, as if they had waited years for permission. Clara didn't wipe them away, didn't apologize, didn't get up to leave. She stayed there, sitting in the kitchen of the mansion where she worked, crying in front of the man who was her employer, letting down the armor she had worn since she learned no one would protect her. Mrs. Zilda appeared at the kitchen door, saw the scene, and for the first time in 15 years of service in that house, the cook smiled with tear-filled eyes and silently returned to the hallway without interrupting. Eduardo said nothing more. He didn't need to. Some things don't ask for words, they ask for presence. And in that kitchen, on an ordinary night of an ordinary week, 2 people who had lived under the same roof for 3 years finally saw each other for real. But what neither of them knew was that that night in the kitchen wouldn't stay between them because someone had seen Denise's farewell message on social media, a vague post full of veiled jabs about being replaced by someone undeserving. And that post was already reaching the eyes of the only person who could turn Clara's life into a battlefield. Renato Ventura, her brother, was already on his way. The doorbell rang late one afternoon, when no one expected visitors. Eduardo was in his office reviewing documents. The twins were playing in the garden with Clara. Missus. Zilda went to the door, drying her hands on her apron, and opened it with the calm of someone who opens that door every day. The man on the other side was not calm. He was tall, rigid in posture, with a leather briefcase under his arm, and the eyes of someone who came for a war. Mrs. Zilda looked him up and down, and before he said anything, the cook already knew who he was. He had Clara's same eyes, the same jawline, the same way of pressing his lips together when holding something back. I need to speak with the owner of this house. And who shall I announce? Renato Ventura, Clara's brother. Missus. Zilda didn't move immediately. She stood there for an instant, measuring the man as one measures the depth of water before stepping in. Then she nodded and went to the office. Eduardo, there's a man at the door. Says he's Clara's brother. Eduardo got up from his chair. Something tightened in his chest, not surprise, but the feeling that something pending had finally arrived. He went downstairs and walked to the entrance. Renato Ventura stood in the hall, radiating hostility. His eyes scanned the mansion with a mixture of anger and discomfort, like someone entering a courtroom knowing the rules were written by the other party. Mr. Matarazzo. Eduardo. Mr. Matarazzo. Renato repeated, and the deliberate choice of formality said everything that needed to be said about the tone of that conversation. I've come to take my sister. Eduardo felt the floor move beneath his feet. Not physically, emotionally. Take Clara. Take her away. The possibility had never crossed his mind, and the fact that it hadn't revealed how much he still thought of Clara as someone who belonged to that house. Someone who would always be there, available, present. As if her dedication were a permanent resource he could use without ever asking the cost. Can we talk? Eduardo gestured to the living room. I don't need a sofa. I don't need coffee, and I don't need pleasantries. I saw what your girlfriend posted on social media. I saw the veiled jabs. I called Clara, and she brushed me off, as she always does. So I came in person. Renato opened his leather briefcase, pulled out printed sheets, and placed them on the console table in the hall, like someone distributing evidence in a hearing. My sister has worked in this house for 3 years. During that time, she was humiliated, disrespected, and threatened by the person you chose to bring into your children's lives. And Clara never said a word. Do you know why? Eduardo didn't answer. He knew the question didn't expect a reply. Because she's afraid of losing her job. Because she's been fired before for caring too much. Because every time my sister dedicates herself to a family that isn't hers, someone finds a reason to cast her aside. And now I discover your girlfriend left, publishing on social media that she was replaced by a housekeeper. The word cut through the air for the second time in that story. Housekeeper, the same word Denise had used. In Renato's mouth, however, it wasn't contempt, it was pain. The pain of a brother who had watched his sister be reduced to a function her entire life. Renato, I need you to. You don't need anything, sir. Clara needs it. She needs someone to look out for her, because she never looks out for herself. She gives everything and keeps nothing. And people like you get used to it. Get used to her dedication, to her silence, to her strength, until the day they break her and throw her away. Eduardo listened to every word, didn't interrupt, didn't defend himself, didn't raise his voice. He stood in the hall of his own house, listening to a man who earned a fraction of what he earned, speak truths worth more than any consultancy Eduardo had ever hired. When Renato finished, breathing heavily, his eyes shining with the intensity of someone who had held that in for too long, Eduardo did the only thing he could do. You're right. Renato blinked. The answer visibly disarmed him. He expected resistance. He expected arrogance. He expected the pattern he knew from all the employers he had faced in his law office. Denial, minimization, counterattack. He didn't expect agreement. Everything you said is correct. Eduardo continued. I didn't see what was happening inside my own house. I brought someone in who mistreated the most important person to my children. And I reduced 3 years of your sister's life to a 6-line file in a drawer. Renato frowned. Eduardo continued. I know about her grandmother. I know Clara cared for her until the end. I know she gave up her own dreams for it. I know she paid for your college education by cleaning 3 houses. I know she was dismissed from the Serene Gardens family because someone was jealous of the care she gave the children. And I know that every Wednesday, she goes to the New Start Center because she still carries a grief no one in this house had the decency to notice. The silence that followed was different from all previous silences in the story. It wasn't Clara's dignified silence, nor Denise's calculated silence, nor the twins' embarrassed silence. It was the silence of 2 men measuring each other, not as enemies, but as 2 people who loved the same woman in different ways, and who, for the first time, were face to face to decide what to do about it. "How do you know all this, sir?" Renato asked, his voice lower now. "Because I finally stopped signing contracts for 5 minutes and paid attention." Renato didn't smile, but the line of his shoulders dropped an inch. His jaw relaxed a fraction. The leather briefcase hung by his side like a weapon no longer needed. "And what do you intend to do, sir?" Before Eduardo could answer, a voice cut through the hall. "Renato!" Clara stood at the door, leading to the garden. The twins were behind her. They with his hands dirty with soil, Enzo holding a small pot with the seedling they had planted weeks before. Clara looked at her brother with an expression that mixed surprise, love, and something that looked very much like fear. "What are you doing here?" "I came to get you, Clara. Get me? I saw what that woman published. I know what happened in this house, and I won't let you go through that again." Clara looked at Eduardo, then at Renato, then at the twins, who watched the scene with wide eyes, sensing the adults' tension without understanding the cause. "Boys, go upstairs to your room. I'll be right there." The twins didn't move. Enzo took a step forward and held Clara's hand. Day stayed where he was, but his chin lifted that gesture he had copied from Clara on the first day when she faced Denise. "Is Clara leaving?" Enzo asked, and his voice carried the weight of a question he had asked before and had sworn to himself he would never have to ask again. Clara knelt down, placed herself at his level, held the boy's face with both hands. "I'm not going anywhere. Remember what I told you?" Enzo nodded slowly. "As long as you need me, I'll be here." Renato watched the scene, and something in his face changed. The anger didn't disappear. It was still there, ingrained, built up over years of watching his sister suffer. But alongside the anger, something else was born. The recognition that perhaps for the first time, Clara's dedication wasn't unilateral. Those children truly loved her, not as toys or habits are loved, but as someone who makes the world feel safe. Clara stood up and led the boys inside. When she returned, she was alone. She stood between Eduardo and Renato like someone refusing to be the object of a dispute. "Renato, I appreciate you coming. I know you worry, but I'm not that girl who needed you to fix everything anymore. I chose to be here. I choose to stay, not out of obligation, not out of fear of losing my job, but because these children need me, and I need them." Renato opened his mouth to reply, but Clara raised her hand. "And if one day I decide to leave, it will be my decision, not Mr. Matarazzo's, not his ex-girlfriend's, and not yours, mine." The hall fell silent. Eduardo felt something he had never felt towards Clara. Not admiration, which already existed, not gratitude, which was already immense. He felt respect, the respect of someone who understands he is standing before someone who doesn't need to be rescued, who never needed to be. Renato looked at his sister for a long time, then looked at Eduardo, and then did something no one expected. He extended his hand. "If anything happens to her in this house, I'll be back, and it won't be for a conversation." Eduardo shook his hand. "If anything happens to her in this house, I'll call you myself." Renato nodded. He hugged his sister. A long, tight hug, the kind that says everything the mouth refuses to utter. Clara held her brother with the same strength, and for an instant, Eduardo saw in her the girl who lost her grandmother, who was left alone, who worked so her brother could study. He saw the whole woman, not just the part he knew. Renato left with the leather briefcase under his arm, his posture a little less rigid, his steps a little less heavy. Eduardo stood at the door, watching his car disappear down the street. Clara was beside him in silence. "Your brother loves you very much. He feels guilty. He thinks he should have helped me more when Grandma got sick. I never let him think differently. Maybe that was my mistake." "No, it's not a mistake to protect those you love." Clara looked at him, and for the second time, Eduardo saw the wall tremble. "No, it's not." That night, a storm swept over the city. The wind battered the mansion windows with a force that made the panes vibrate. Eduardo was in his office when he heard something that made him jump out of his chair. A low, muffled cry coming from the twins' room. He ran down the hallway, opened the door. Enzo was sitting on his bed, curled up, with the blanket pulled up to his chin, his eyes filled with tears. With each clap of thunder, the boy's body convulsed, as if expecting a blow. Eduardo sat on the bed beside him. He didn't know what to do. He had no script for this. He had no experience. So he did what he had seen Clara do, the only reference he had for how to care for a frightened child. He pulled Enzo close, put his arm around him, and stayed there in silence, while the thunder shook the world outside. "Father, I don't like the noise. Father, not Mr. Father." Eduardo closed his eyes, held his son tighter, and felt tears stream down his own face, without asking permission, without warning, without control. Because that single word, father, was worth more than any contract, any sum, any achievement he had accumulated in his entire life. "I know, my son. I'm here." Enzo leaned his head against Eduardo's chest. The thunder continued, but the boy stopped trembling. They woke up to the noise, looked at the scene, said nothing, got out of his own bed, crossed the room, and slipped under his father's free arm. Eduardo held both of them, one on each side, his hands open on his children's backs. And in that room, in the midst of the storm, something finally rebuilt itself. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't complete. It was a beginning, fragile as a newly planted seedling, but alive. At the bedroom door, a shadow stopped. Clara had come to check on the boys as she did every night. She saw Eduardo holding his two children. She saw Enzo leaning against his father's chest. She saw Tay clutching his arm. She didn't enter. She didn't need to. She leaned against the doorframe, crossed her arms, and smiled. A small, silent smile no one saw. The smile of someone who planted something with her own hands and finally sees the first sprout breaking through the earth. The next morning, the storm cleared to a sky so clean it seemed washed. Light streamed through the mansion windows with a different intensity, as if the sun itself wanted to illuminate what had previously been hidden in the corners. Eduardo woke up in the twins' room, sitting in the armchair between the two beds, his neck stiff and his back aching from every hour. Slept in that position, but he was smiling. Enzo was still asleep, curled in his blanket, his face serene, no trace of the previous night's fear. Tay was awake, lying on his stomach, drawing in the sketchbook he never put down. When he realized his father had opened his eyes, he held up the sketchbook and showed it. "Look, father." Eduardo leaned in. The drawing showed 3 figures under a blanket, rain falling around them, and all 3 figures were smiling. Below, in the same shaky, enormous handwriting, Tay had written, "The Thunder Night." Eduardo looked at the drawing for a long time, then looked at his son. "Can I keep this one?" Tay tore the page from his sketchbook and handed it over with a naturalness that was beautiful and painful, as if giving something to his father was finally a gesture that made sense. Eduardo folded the paper and put it in his pocket. Now he carried 2 drawings. The first, the man with the briefcase, alone on the other side of the paper. It was the accusation. The second was the beginning of the answer. The days that followed were not magical. There was no instant transformation. Eduardo still made mistakes. He forgot Enzo didn't like the crusts of bread. He put too much toothpaste on Tay's brush. He tried to tell bedtime stories and lost his train of thought halfway through, inventing absurd endings that made the twins laugh not at the story, but at the disaster their father made of telling it. But he stayed every night, even when the boys fell asleep quickly, even when he had urgent emails, even when his body craved his bed and not the cramped armchair between his children's beds. Eduardo stayed, and gradually, imperceptibly, the ice melted. Enzo began to wait for his father at the bedroom door before bed, holding the glass of water with lemon clara prepared, as if to show Eduardo that this was the ritual, and now he was a part of it. Tay began to draw with his door open, instead of hiding his sketchbooks under his pillow. Small changes, enormous achievements. Clara observed everything with her usual discretion. She didn't distance herself, but she made space. Where before she was the only nighttime presence in the twins' room, now there was Eduardo. And she adjusted her orbit without jealousy, without resentment, with the wisdom of someone who understood that the best thing that could happen to those children was to have their father back. One afternoon, Eduardo found her in the garden. Clara was kneeling near the flower bed, tending the seedlings she had planted with the boys weeks earlier. Eduardo stopped beside her and looked at the pots. "Any news?" Clara pointed to one of the seedlings. At the top of the thin stem, something was budding. Small, closed, but unmistakable. "It's coming. A few more days, and it will open." Eduardo knelt beside her, looked at that tiny bud that insisted on existing, despite the soil, the weather, and the storm that had battered the garden days before. "You said things worth waiting for usually take time." Clara nodded without looking at him, her hands in the earth, her eyes on the plant. "And was it worth the wait?" Clara stopped what she was doing, remained still for an instant, and then looked at him, not with the professional wall, not with the neutrality of an employee, but with the eyes of someone who allowed herself to be seen. Always. Eduardo held her gaze, and in that garden, on their knees in the dirt, with dirty hands and the silence of the late afternoon around them, something established itself between the two. It wasn't declared, it wasn't named. It didn't need to be. There were things that existed before words, and this was one of them. Weeks later, Renato returned to the mansion. This time he didn't ring the doorbell with hostility. He rang and waited, hands in his pockets, looking at the garden with an expression that mixed caution and curiosity. Mrs. Zilda opened the door and, for the first time, smiled at him. Clara's brother. Come in. Renato entered and found something he didn't expect. The twins were in the dining room with Clara and Eduardo. Te was drawing. Enzo was building something with blocks. Clara helped Enzo balance a tower while Eduardo watched, trying to suggest a piece and being vetoed by his son with a hand gesture that drew laughter from everyone. Renato stood at the entrance to the room, observing as Eduardo had observed on the first day from the doorway, unseen, trying to understand what was happening within a scene he wasn't part of. But this time someone saw him. Uncle Renato! The twins ran to him. Renato knelt down and received them both with an awkward hug of someone who isn't practiced with children but tries with all his might. Clara laughed, an open, unrestrained laugh that Eduardo had never heard before. The sound filled the entire room. Renato stood up and looked at Eduardo. The two measured each other for an instant, a remnant of the previous confrontation, of the distrust that still lingered like a thin cloud. But Eduardo extended his hand first. Stay for dinner. Renato looked at Clara. She nodded with a discreet smile. He shook Eduardo's hand. I'll stay. Dinner was at the kitchen table, not in the formal dining room with its 12 places and silver cutlery in the kitchen. Mrs. Zilda served the food, complaining that she hadn't prepared enough, though there was food for twice as many people. Te sat beside Renato and showed him his drawings. Enzo sat beside Clara, as always, but with a difference. His father's chair was right there, and every now and then the boy would look at Eduardo and smile. Renato told stories from his law office, cases of workers who had won their rights, small victories that for the people involved were immense. Clara listened with a silent pride that couldn't be contained on her face. Eduardo listened with something that resembled admiration. The admiration of someone who recognizes that there are battles more important than those fought in boardrooms overlooking the city. At one point, Te pulled out his sketchbook and began to draw during dinner. No one complained, no one told him to put it away. When he finished, he turned the sketchbook to the table. 5 stick figures in a large boat, all together, all smiling, and below, in the shaky handwriting that was now his trademark, my family. Eduardo looked at the drawing, counted the figures. 5. 2 boys, a woman beside them, a man on the other side, and another older figure in the center, Mrs. Zilda, with what appeared to be a pot in her hand. No figure was alone, no figure held a briefcase. All were inside the boat. Eduardo got up from the table, left the kitchen, walked to the hall, leaned against the wall, and reached into his jacket pocket, where the 2 previous drawings were still folded. He pulled out the first, the man with the briefcase, alone, separated from his family. He pulled out the second, the Thunder Knight, 3 figures under the blanket, and now the third, the boat, all together. 3 drawings, 3 chapters of the same transformation, written by a child who didn't use words to say what he felt, but who said everything with pencil and paper. Mrs. Zilda appeared in the hall, looked at him, looked at the 3 drawings open in his hands, and said with the calm voice of someone who had waited for a moment for a very long time, "What needed to begin now has a name, Eduardo." He looked at her. His eyes stung, his throat tightened. "And what's the name, Zilda?" The cook smiled. The same smile she had given the night she saw Clara cry in the kitchen. The smile of someone watching a family build itself brick by brick, meal by meal, silence by silence. "Go back inside. You'll find out for yourself." Eduardo returned to the kitchen, sat in his chair. They immediately pushed the sketchbook towards him, asking him to draw together. Eduardo picked up the pencil and drew something horrible, a deformed figure that was supposed to be a dog. Enzo burst out laughing. Clara covered her mouth to keep from laughing. Renato had no such mercy and laughed openly. "Father, is that a dog or a sofa?" Te asked. Father, without formality, without distance, without the weight of sir that had marked all the previous days. Just father, spoken with the naturalness of someone who finally believes the word belongs to that person. Eduardo laughed. A real laugh. The kind that comes from deep within and asks no permission. Sometime later, on a Sunday morning, Eduardo went down to the garden and found Clara kneeling before the flower bed. Beside her, the twins. The three looked at the seedling they had planted together. The flower had opened. It was small, delicate, with petals that seemed fragile, but which had survived the storm, the cold, and the waiting. Clara touched one of the petals with the tip of her finger, as if verifying it was real. Enzo looked at his father. "Father, come see." It bloomed. Eduardo descended the steps and crouched beside his children. He looked at the flower, then at Clara. She was smiling. That rare, true smile that wasn't for an audience or for protocol. It was hers, just hers. "It took time," Eduardo said. "But it opened," Clara replied. Te extended his hand to Enzo. Enzo extended his hand to Clara. Clara looked at Eduardo, and Eduardo, without saying anything, placed his hand over the hands of the three, 4 hands stacked, like a renewed pact, stronger than the first, because now someone who was missing before was there. Eduardo didn't become a perfect father. He still worked too much, still forgot details, still told stories at bedtime, and lost the thread halfway through, inventing absurd endings that made the twins laugh for the wrong reason. But he was present not as a visitor, but as a constant, imperfect, real presence. Clara didn't become another person. She continued going to the New Start Center on Wednesdays. She continued carrying her grandmother's grief as part of who she was. She continued to be silent, strong, and unshakable when she needed to be. But now, every now and then, she allowed herself not to be strong, allowed herself to laugh loudly in the kitchen, allowed herself to cry when longing weighed on her, allowed herself to exist not just as the woman who cared, but as the woman who was also cared for. Renato began to visit the mansion frequently. He never completely lost his distrust. It was part of his temperament, his history, the armor he wore to protect his sister, but he saw enough to understand that this time it was different. Not perfect, different. Mrs. Zilda continued in the kitchen, continued seeing everything, continued saying little and meaning much. And one of those afternoons, as she organized the next week's provisions, she looked out the kitchen window and saw something that made her stop. Eduardo was in the garden, sitting on the grass beside Clara. The twins ran around them. Te carried his sketchbook under his arm. Enzo held a watering can that was too big for him, spilling water everywhere, but on the plant. And Clara was telling a story, the same story of the bird that couldn't fly, but that walked so far it knew more places than all the other birds combined. Only this time, the story had a different ending. And one day, Clara said, as the twins stopped running to listen, the bird found other birds who also liked to walk. And it discovered that it didn't need to fly to go far, it just needed company for the journey. Enzo sat on Clara's lap. They sat beside his father, and the 4 stayed there in the garden. Clara cultivated without anyone asking. Under the light of a late afternoon that was in no hurry to end, Mrs. Zilda smiled from the window, wiped a tear with her apron, and returned to the kitchen. Some stories don't end with grand gestures, don't end with public declarations, nor with perfect endings tied with golden bows. Some stories end in the simplest and most powerful way there is, with someone who finally found their place, and with someone who was finally seen.